The ship was dying, and Vathan Kell knew it better than anyone. He pressed all four of his hands against the console and stared at the warnings that flashed across every screen in the engine room, each one screaming at him in bright orange text that something else had broken, something else had cracked, something else was leaking into the cold emptiness of space. The shimmering drift had been a good ship once, a proud Veloxy cargo hauler with clean lines and a humming drive core that sang when it ran at full speed. But that was before the Dralkith had found them 2 systems back, before the plasma fire had torn through their hull like paper, before Vathan had spent 19 hours straight sealing cracks with emergency paste and whispering prayers to gods he did not believe in. Vathan, Captain Risava's voice came through the speaker above his head, tired and thin, like someone who had not slept in days. Tell me something good. Cracked FTL motivator. At the atmospheric processor that wheezed and coughed like a sick animal, at the hull integrity number that kept dropping 1 digit at a time. We are not dead yet, he said, and that was the best he could offer. On the bridge, Risava leaned back in her chair and rubbed her face with 2 of her 4 hands, while the other 2 gripped the armrests hard enough to leave marks in the metal. She was old for a Veloxy. Her carapace faded from deep blue to pale gray, and she had been running from the Dralkith Dominion for longer than most of her crew had been alive. "Where is the nearest port that will take us?" she asked. Her navigator, a nervous young Veloxy named Tosk, pulled up the star charts and scrolled through them with shaking fingers. Every station in this sector was either Dralkith-controlled, Dralkith-allied, or smart enough to refuse entry to a blacklisted species. "There is one place," Tosk said quietly, "but you will not like it. I already do not like anything. Just tell me." "Sol system, the human world, Earth." Risava stared at him for a long moment before letting out a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a groan. "Earth, the primitive backwater, the planet of loud, short-lived creatures who had stumbled into space barely 30 years ago, who most galactic species treated as a joke or a curiosity, or both." "Do they even have a dock?" Risava asked. "The charts say they do," Tosk replied, "and more importantly, they are not on the Dralkith network. They do not honor the blacklist." That was enough. Risava gave the order, and the shimmering drift limped towards Sol on half power, trailing sparks and leaking atmosphere from 3 separate breaches that Vathan had patched with nothing but sealant and stubbornness. They crossed into human-controlled space 6 hours later, and almost immediately a signal found them. A sharp, clear voice cutting through the static on their communication channel. "Unidentified vessel. This is Commander Elena Vasquez of the Earth Orbital Dock Authority. You are entering Sol space, and your ship looks like it lost a fight with a garbage compactor. State your situation." Risava blinked at the bluntness of the message, and then opened the channel with careful, formal words, the way she had been taught to address alien species. "Commander Vasquez, we are the Veloxy cargo vessel Shimmering Drift. We have sustained heavy damage and request permission to dock for emergency repairs. We can offer trade goods as payment and will depart as soon as—" "Yeah, I can see the damage from here," Vasquez interrupted, and there was something in her voice that Risava could not identify at first. It took her a moment to realize it was concern. "You are leaking atmosphere from your port side, and your engine signature looks like it is about to flatline. Do you have wounded on board?" "Board are 3 crew members with burns," Risava admitted. "Bay 7 is open. Get in here now. I am sending a medical team to meet you at the airlock." The channel closed before Risava could respond, and she sat there in silence for a moment, unsure what to make of a species that did not ask for credentials, did not check the blacklist, did not negotiate terms, just opened a door because someone was hurt. The shimmering drift docked with a groan of metal and a hiss of pressure seals, and the airlock opened to reveal something Vathan had not expected. A team of humans, in work clothes and tool belts, already moving, already talking over each other in that fast, loud way humans apparently communicated. At the front of them was an old man with white hair, deep lines on his face, and hands that were covered in grease stains so old they looked permanent. He wore a name patch on his chest that read McCrae, but everyone around him called him. Pops walked straight past the Veloxy crew without a word of greeting, went right to the engine room, looked at the FTL motivator for about 10 seconds, and then turned to his team with a face that showed pure offense. "Who the hell bolted this together? A committee?" he said, and then he started pulling tools from his belt and barking orders at his crew like a general on a battlefield. Vathan followed him in a state of shock. He had expected suspicion, or cold professionalism, or maybe a list of fees and forms to fill out. That was how every other station in the galaxy operated. Instead, he got an old human who was already elbow-deep in his engine, muttering about shoddy weld joints and criminal power routing. "Excuse me," Vathan tried. "We only need a simple patch, enough to get us to the next." "Son," Pop said without looking up, "I have been fixing engines since before you were hatched. This drive is not getting patched, it is getting fixed. Now hand me that plasma wrench and stay out of my way." Vathan handed him the wrench with two of his hands, while the other two hung limp at his sides in complete bewilderment. Over the next several hours, something happened that Vathan could not explain. The humans did not just repair the damage, they started arguing with each other about how to make things better. One engineer pulled up Veloxy schematics she had never seen before and compared them to human designs, pointing at differences and asking, "What if we tried this instead?" While another one crawled under the drive housing with a scanner and started mapping inefficiencies that Vathan himself had never noticed. They were not following a manual, they were thinking, adapting, inventing, experimenting in real time on technology they had never touched before, and they were doing it with a kind of joyful intensity that made Vathan's antennae twitch with nervous energy. Found Commander Vasquez, standing near the airlock, watching the chaos with her arms crossed, and a look on her face that suggested this was completely normal to her. "Your people," Vathan said carefully, "they are very enthusiastic." Vasquez smiled at him, a strange expression that showed teeth, which in most galactic species was a threat, but in humans apparently meant warmth. "Yeah," she said, "give a human a broken thing and they will not sleep until it works better than it did before. It's kind of our whole deal." She reached behind her and picked up a small ceramic cup filled with dark liquid that smelled like nothing Vathan had ever encountered, rich and bitter and somehow warm, even from a distance. "Here," she said, holding it out to him. "You look like you need this. What is it?" "Coffee. Best thing our species ever made, and yes, I am including space travel in that ranking." Vathan took the cup in two of his hands and brought it to his mandibles. The liquid was hot and dark, and when it touched his tongue, something happened inside his brain that he had no words for. Every thought became sharper. Every sense became clearer. Every sound in the room became crisp and bright, like the world had been slightly blurry his entire life, and someone had just adjusted the focus. His 4 hands began to tremble, not from fear, but from the sheer electric rush of whatever chemical the humans had just introduced into his system. Vasquez watched him with that tooth-showing smile and said, "Good, right?" Vathan stared down at the cup, and then back at her, and then at the engine room, full of loud, inventive humans who had dropped everything to help strangers they owed nothing to, and he said the only honest thing he could think of, "What is wrong with your species?" Vasquez laughed, a loud, bright sound that echoed through the docking bay, and she poured him another cup. 3 days had passed, and the shimmering drift was supposed to be fixed by now. Vathan had expected a quick patch, maybe a weld here and a seal there, enough to limp to the next system. Instead, when he walked into the engine room on the morning of the 4th day, he found that the humans had essentially taken his entire ship apart and were putting it back together as something else entirely. Pops McRae was standing on top of the FTL motivator housing with a welding torch in one hand and a sandwich in the other, somehow using both at the same time without burning himself or the bread. He had not slept in what appeared to be 2 days, and when Vathan pointed this out, the old man just shrugged and said sleep is for people who are not having fun. The hull plating was the first thing Vathan noticed. The cracked and scarred Veloxi panels that had protected the ship for 15 years were gone, replaced with something new, something that gleamed under the dock lights with a strange layered pattern that looked almost organic. "What is this material?" Vathan asked, running 2 of his hands across the surface, while the other 2 clutched his ever-present cup of coffee. He had not put the coffee down in 3 days, and he was not planning to start now. "Standard composite," said a young human engineer named Diego, who was bolting the last panel into place. "Carbon nanolattice with a ceramic thermal layer. We use it on our atmospheric shuttles." "Standard?" Vathan repeated, his antenna rising in disbelief. "Yeah, it's about 40% lighter than what you had before, and roughly twice as strong. We had a bunch of extra sheets in storage, so Pop said to just swap it all out." Vathan leaned against the wall and tried to process this information. The Veloxi had purchased their hull plating from a Karathi trading post at considerable expense, and it was considered mid-grade material by galactic standards. Humans had just replaced it with something superior and called it standard. That was not even the most shocking part. The atmospheric processor, the wheezing machine that had nearly killed them all when it started leaking toxic fumes 2 systems back, was not just repaired. A human engineer named Priya had completely rewired it and connected it to a heat exchange system that captured waste energy from the engines and converted it into auxiliary power. "You are generating electricity from your own exhaust now," Priya explained cheerfully, as if this was a small and obvious thing. "It is not a lot of power, but it should keep your backup systems running without draining the main reactor." Vathan stared at her, and then at the processor, and then at his coffee, and decided he needed more coffee before he could have this conversation. The Veloxi had been flying ships for over 400 years, and not one of their engineers had ever thought to do what this young engineer just did. Human had done in an afternoon with spare parts and enthusiasm. Down in the cargo bay, Tosk had abandoned all pretense of being useful, and had fully committed to following the humans around like a baby animal that had imprinted on the wrong species. Someone on the dock crew, a large, cheerful man named Marcus, had given the young Veloxi a pair of small devices that fit into his ear openings and connected to a human music library. The first thing Tosk heard was something called metal, and it changed him forever. Vathan found his junior technicians standing in a corridor, all 4 arms moving in wild rhythmic motions, his head bobbing up and down, while sounds that could only be described as controlled violence poured from the tiny speakers in his ears. The music was loud and fast, and full of a kind of aggressive joy that the Veloxi had no cultural equivalent for. "Tosk," Vathan said firmly, "you are supposed to be monitoring the sensor array." Him, or chose not to. His eyes were closed, and all 4 of his arms were making gestures that Marcus had apparently taught him. Something humans called air guitar, which as far as Vathan could tell, served no practical purpose whatsoever, but brought Tosk more happiness than anything had in months. Vathan decided to let it go. The boy had been terrified since the Dralkith attack, barely eating, barely sleeping, flinching at every unexpected sound. If human noise was what it took to make him feel alive again, then Vathan was not going to be the one to take it away. Later that day, Vathan found Commander Vasquez in the dock's command center and asked the question that had been eating at him since they arrived. "Why are you doing this?" Vasquez looked up from her console, where she had been reviewing supply manifests, and raised one eyebrow, a human expression that Vathan had learned could mean many things. "Doing what?" "All of it. The repairs, the decisions, everything. Upgrades, the food, the medical treatment for our wounded. You have asked for nothing in return. You have not demanded payment or territory, or service contracts. In every port in the galaxy, there is a price, and you have not named one. Vasquez leaned back in her chair and picked up her own coffee cup. The woman drank the stuff like water, Vathan had noticed, and she became noticeably less friendly when the cup was empty. "You showed up at our door with a broken ship and hurt people," she said simply. "We fix things. That is what we do. It is not complicated." "It is very complicated," Vathan insisted. "Nothing in the galaxy is free. Everything has a cost. Every species wants something." Vasquez looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then she said something that Vathan would remember for the rest of his life. "Maybe that is why the galaxy is so messed up." He had no answer for that. He opened his mandibles and closed them again, and then just stood there holding his coffee, while something shifted inside his understanding of the universe. Some fundamental assumption about how civilizations worked, cracking like old hull plating, and falling away to reveal something new underneath. Meanwhile, in a quiet office 3 levels above the docking bay, something very different was happening. Lieutenant Ji-Yon Park sat across a table from Captain Risava with a datapad in her hands, and an expression on her face that was calm and pleasant and revealed absolutely nothing. "Tell me about the Draelkith patrol routes in the Outer Veil sector," Park said, her voice soft and conversational, as if she was asking about the weather. Risava looked at the human woman carefully. Park was small even by human standards, with dark hair pulled back tight and eyes that watched everything and gave away nothing. She reminded Risava of the deep-water predators on her home world, the ones that floated perfectly still until something swam close enough. "Why do you want to know?" Risava asked. "Professional curiosity." "You are building a military intelligence file on the Draelkith Dominion." Park did not deny it. She simply waited with that same pleasant expression, and Risava felt a chill crawl up her carapace that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Commander Vasquez told us we were safe here," Risava said slowly. "She said Earth does not honor the Draelkith blacklist. But you are not just offering shelter, are you? You are preparing for something." Park set her datapad down and folded her hands on the table. "The Draelkith have enslaved 47 species across 6 sectors," Park said, and her voice was still soft, but there was something underneath it now. Something hard and cold, like metal under silk. "They operate the largest slave economy in the known galaxy, and they have been expanding toward human space for the last 8 years. Something, Captain. We are preparing for them." Risava felt her throat tighten. She had spent her whole life running from the Draelkith, watching her people be hunted and captured and sold, watching the galaxy look the other way because the Dominion was too powerful to challenge. And here was this small, quiet human sitting across from her, talking about them like they were a problem to be solved. "You do not understand what you are dealing with," Risava said. "They have 1,000 warships. They have conquered species that were old when your kind was still living in caves." Park smiled. It was a thin, precise expression that did not reach her eyes, and Risava realized with sudden clarity that this woman was not afraid, not even a little bit. "Good," Park said quietly. "I was worried this would be boring." That night, Vathan discovered something remarkable entirely by accident. He had been drinking coffee steadily for 3 days, and had noticed that it made him more alert and focused the way it did for humans. But when he accidentally mixed it with a Veloxy nutritional supplement that contained a specific metabolic enzyme, something extraordinary happened. The caffeine bonded with the enzyme and produced a state of hyperfocus so intense that Vathan could see the individual threads in the fabric of his uniform, could hear conversations 3 rooms away, could solve engineering equations in his head that normally required a computer. It lasted for 2 hours, and when it faded, he sat on the floor of his quarters and stared at the ceiling and whispered, "Oh no." Within 24 hours, every single member of the Veloxy crew had tried the combination, and every single one was hopelessly addicted. Tosk was doing complex sensor calibrations while headbanging, Rasava was reading intelligence reports at 3 times her normal speed, and the ship's medic was reorganizing the entire medical bay with a level of precision. Precision that bordered on obsessive. Pops found out about the situation, and instead of being concerned, he rubbed his hands together with delight and said, "Hold on, let me adjust the brew ratio." By the end of the day, he had created a special blend specifically calibrated for Veloxy biology that he called bug juice. And the Veloxy crew loved it so much they nearly wept. Vathan stood in the engine room of his transformed ship, surrounded by human engineers and Veloxy crew members, all working side by side, the smell of coffee and welding smoke mixing in the recycled air. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the knot of fear in his chest was gone. He did not know it yet, but it would not stay gone for long, because somewhere out in the dark between the stars, 5 Drillkith warships had just locked onto the Shimmering Drift's energy signature and changed course for Sol. The alarm hit like a punch to the chest, a deep pulsing sound that echoed through every corridor of the Earth orbital dock and turned every head on every deck in a single frozen moment. Vathan was in the engine room, checking the new hybrid power couplings when the sound reached him, and his antennae went flat against his skull, because he knew that sound. Not this specific alarm. No, he had never heard a human warning klaxon before, but he knew what it meant, the way any prey animal knows the shadow of a predator. Something had found them. On the bridge of the dock station, Commander Vasquez was already at her console, coffee forgotten on the desk beside her, eyes locked on the sensor display where 5 red icons had just appeared at the edge of the Sol system, like drops of blood on a clean white sheet. "Talk to me," she said to the sensor operator. 5 contacts, military configuration, just dropped out of FTL near the Kuiper Belt. Energy signatures. Match Drillkith Hunter-Killer class vessels. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water, and for a moment, nobody spoke. Vasquez stared at the screen and felt something tighten in her jaw. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the space between caution and fury. The communication channel crackled, and a voice filled the command center. Deep, rasping, speaking in accented galactic common, with the casual arrogance that the Drillkith wore like a second skin. "Attention, inhabitants of the Sol system. I am Strike Commander Vorath of the Drillkith Dominion. You are harboring stolen property belonging to the Dominion. The Veloxy designation Shimmering Drift and its crew are classified as runaway assets. You will surrender them to us immediately, or face the consequences of obstructing Dominion law." Silence filled the command center. Every human in the room looked at Vasquez. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, something happens behind her eyes. Something that anyone who knew her would recognize as the moment Elena Vasquez stopped being patient. She opened the channel. "Strike Commander Vorath. This is Commander Elena Vasquez of the Earth Orbital Dock Authority. I want to make sure I understand you correctly. You just flew 5 warships into my system without permission, threatened my station, and referred to living, thinking people as your property." "The Veloxy are registered assets of the Dominion," Vorath replied, and there was amusement in his voice, the lazy confidence of someone who had done this 100 times before. "This is not a matter for debate. Surrender them, or—" "Let me stop you right there," Vasquez said, and her voice had gone quiet in a way that made the hair stand up on the arms of every human in the room. "The individuals aboard the Shimmering Drift are guests under the protection of Earth. They are not property, they are not assets, they are people, and you are trespassing in sovereign human space. You have 60 seconds to reverse course and leave the Sol system." Vorath laughed. It was a wet, rattling sound that came from deep in his reptilian throat, and it carried with it 200 years of Drillkith supremacy and the absolute certainty that this small, young, insignificant species posed no threat whatsoever. "Humans," he said, the word dripping with contempt. "You have been in space for less than the blink of an eye. You have no fleet, no weapons worth mentioning, and no allies who would come to your aid. I will give you one more chance to hand over our property before I reduce your little station to scrap metal." Vasquez looked at the countdown timer she had started, 38 seconds left, and then she looked at Lieutenant Park, who had appeared in the command center so quietly that no one had noticed her. "Arrive." Park met her eyes and gave one small nod. "Your 60 seconds are up, Commander Vorath," Vasquez said into the channel. "I gave you a chance. Remember that." She closed the channel and turned to Park. "Light 'em up." Park sat down at the tactical console and entered a series of commands with fingers that moved like they had been waiting for this moment for years. Across the Sol system, something extraordinary began to happen. The mining platform orbiting Jupiter unfolded. What had appeared to be a standard resource extraction facility split apart like a flower blooming in fast motion, revealing rows of missile batteries and targeting arrays that locked onto the Dralkith signatures before the debris panels had even finished retracting. A cluster of communication satellites near Mars shed their outer shells and became a network of autonomous weapons platforms, each one bristling with particle beam emitters that hummed to life with a sound like a choir warming up. And from behind Earth's moon, hidden in the shadow where no sensor sweep had ever thought to look, came the ships. They were not what anyone expected. Not the clumsy, oversized warships that most galactic species built. They were small and fast and angular, like knives designed to fly, and there were dozens of them, corvettes and frigates and fast attack craft, that poured out of concealed hangars with an eagerness that was almost joyful. Vathan had run to the observation deck when the alarm sounded, and he stood there now with his 4 hands pressed against the glass and his mandibles hanging open as he watched the human fleet deploy. Beside him, Risava stood in equal shock, her compound eyes wide, her body completely still. "They told the galaxy they had no military fleet," Risava whispered. "They lied," Vathan whispered back. They had not exactly lied. What they had done was worse. They had let every species in. Galaxy believe what it wanted to believe, that humans were primitive, harmless, too young and too small to matter. And while the galaxy was busy dismissing them, the humans had spent 30 years studying every piece of alien technology that passed through their system, analyzing it, improving it, and building something entirely their own. The Dralkith had barely processed what was happening when the first Corvette squadron hit them. 3 human ships came screaming in at a speed that should not have been possible for craft that size, broke formation at the last second like a flock of predatory birds, and struck the lead Dralkith destroyer from 3 different angles simultaneously. The destroyer's shields flickered and died. Dralkith shields were designed to absorb sustained frontal bombardment, the standard tactic used by every species they had ever fought. They were not designed for 3 small ships hitting from 3 directions with 3 different weapon types. At the exact same moment, the second Dralkith ship tried to return fire, and found that the human ships were simply not where its targeting computers expected them to be. They moved wrong, changed direction without warning, accelerated and decelerated in patterns that no military doctrine in the galaxy had a name for. Because there was no doctrine, Vathan realized with a chill. The human pilots were improvising. Every single one of them was fighting differently. No 2 ships used the same approach. No 2 pilots made the same choices. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos, a storm with a brain, and the Dralkith had no idea how to respond to it. Park coordinated the battle from the station with a calm focus that bordered on inhuman. She moved squadrons like chess pieces, anticipated Dralkith maneuvers before they happened, and spoke in short clipped sentences that carried absolute authority. "Falcon Wing, break left and target there. Engine cluster. Hammer Wing, hold position, and wait for them to turn. They will turn. Now." They turned, and Hammer Wing was waiting. The third Drellkith ship came apart in a bloom of white fire that was visible from the station with the naked eye. The fourth tried to flee, and was run down by a corvette that matched its speed, pulled alongside it like a car on a highway, and fired directly into its bridge at point-blank range. The pilot of that corvette was heard over the open channel, laughing. The fifth and final Drellkith ship, Vorath's command vessel, attempted to jump to FTL, but a human electronic warfare platform had been quietly jamming its drive systems for the past 4 minutes, and the engines sputtered and failed. The ship hung dead in space, lights flickering, and within seconds, a team of human marines and boarding craft latched onto its hull, like wolves bringing down a wounded animal. The battle had lasted 11 minutes. From the first shot to the last, 5 Drellkith hunter-killer warships, each one capable of terrorizing an entire system, destroyed or captured by a species that the galaxy considered a joke. Vathin's legs gave out. He sat down on the cold floor of the observation deck and stared at the stars, and tried to understand what he had just seen. His people, the Veloxi, had been running from the Drellkith for 200 years, had watched their colonies burn, had seen their families dragged away in chains, had accepted with the quiet despair of the powerless that this was simply how things were and always would be. And then they had landed on a planet of loud, coffee-drinking, music-blasting lunatics who had looked at the greatest military threat in the sector and beaten it like it was nothing. Risava stood beside him, and she was trembling, and Vathin realized she was not afraid. She was trying not to cry. The airlock opened behind them, and Vasquez walked onto the observation deck, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She looked at the debris field still glowing on the screen, then looked at the 2 Veloxi sitting on her floor, and she sat down beside them and held out the cups. "You okay?" she asked. Vathin took the coffee and looked at her with all the desperate, confused wonder of someone whose entire understanding of the universe had just been rearranged. "What are you people?" he asked. Vasquez took a sip of her own coffee and looked out at the stars. "We are humans," she said, "and nobody messes with our guests." The news traveled faster than light. Within hours of the battle, every communication relay in the sector was carrying the same story. 5 Drellkith hunter-killer warships had entered the Sol system and demanded the surrender of a Veloxi crew. The humans had refused, and then the humans had destroyed the entire squadron in 11 minutes. The galactic reaction was immediate and divided. Some species laughed and called it propaganda. Some went quiet and started pulling up everything they had on human military capability, which was almost nothing, which suddenly felt like a very large oversight. And the Drellkith Dominion, in its vast dark capital on the world of Drelka Prime, did what the Drellkith always did when something small dared to bite back. They decided to make an example. Strike Fleet Vorath had been a scouting force, 5 ships sent to retrieve property. What the Dominion assembled now was something else entirely. From 6 sector commands, heavy cruisers and battleships, and carrier groups loaded with drone fighters. The largest fleet the Dominion had pointed at a single target in over a century. The message was clear. Earth would burn, and every species in the galaxy would watch and remember what happened to those who defied the Drellkith. On Earth's orbital station, Vathin watched the intelligence reports scroll across the screen and felt the familiar cold weight settle back into his chest. 300 warships. The number was absurd, overwhelming, a hammer being swung at a nail. And it was his fault, all of it, because the shimmering drift had come here for repairs and brought the storm with them. He found Risava in the conference room, where she was meeting with Vasquez and Park, and he waited until there was a pause before he spoke. "Captain, we should leave." Every head in the room turned to him. "If we take the shimmering drift and go, the Drellkith may follow us. They want us, not the humans. If we leave now, we can draw them away, and Earth will be spared." Risava looked at him with an expression that said she had been thinking the same thing, and she turned to Vasquez with the careful formality of someone offering a gift they could not afford. "He is right, Commander. We brought this to your door. Let us lead them away. You have done more for us than any species in the galaxy ever has, and we will not repay that kindness by letting your world be destroyed." Vasquez sat back in her chair and crossed her arms and looked at Risava with an expression that Vathan could not read. And then she looked at Park, and Park looked back at her, and something passed between them in that glance that needed no words. "No," Vasquez said. "Commander!" I said no, you are not leaving, and we are not handing you over, and we are not running. That is not how this works. "Warships," Risava said, and there was desperation in her voice now. "You beat 5. 5 is not 300. This is not the same fight." "You are right," Park said from her corner of the table, and she pulled up a holographic display of the Sol system that was covered in tactical markers and fleet positions. "It is a much more interesting fight." Risava stared at her in disbelief, and Vathan realized something that he had been slow to understand. The humans were not being brave in the way he had always thought of bravery, the grim acceptance of sacrifice, the willingness to die for a cause. They were being brave in a way that was entirely alien to him. They were excited. Not happy, not reckless, not naive. They understood the danger, he could see it, in the tight line of Vasquez's jaw and the cold focus in Park's eyes. But underneath the understanding there was something else, something that burned like the coffee they drank. That said, this is what we are for. The mobilization began that same day, and it was unlike anything Vathan had ever seen. Word spread across Earth that a hostile fleet was coming, and instead of panic, instead of fear, instead of the desperate scramble to evacuate that any reasonable species would undertake, the humans got to work. Military reserves activated within hours, but it was not just the military. Civilian engineers volunteered to refit ships. Factories shifted production to weapons components overnight. University students who had been studying astrophysics last week were now calculating firing solutions. And a group of retired hackers offered to write electronic warfare programs for free, because as one of them said, "We have been waiting our whole lives for someone to let us hack aliens." Pops McRae was in the center of all of it. The old man had not slept in 2 days, and showed no signs of slowing down. He had taken over the main repair bay, and was supervising the refit of every ship that came through the dock, working alongside engineers a third his age, and outpacing most of them. Vathan found him under the hull of a Corvette at 3 in the morning, welding a reinforcement plate with steady hands, while a young engineer held a light for him. "You should rest," Vathan said. Pops did not stop welding. "I spent 30 years in the Navy," the old man said, his voice muffled behind his welding mask. "Lost friends in wars that most people have already forgotten about. Every single one of those men and women would spit in my face if I handed over good people to slavers because I was scared." He finished the weld, flipped up his mask, and looked at Vathan with eyes that were old and tired and absolutely unbreakable. "We do not run, son. Not from this, not ever from this." Vathan wanted to argue, wanted to explain that the Veloxi had been running for 200 years, and that it was not cowardice, but survival. That sometimes running was all you had. But he looked at this old human with grease on his face and fire in his heart, and the words died before they reached his mandibles. Because maybe that was the difference. Maybe the Veloxi had been running for so long that they had forgotten there was another option. Park pulled Vathan into the war effort on the second day, not as a spectator, but as a collaborator. She brought him to a room full of human engineers and said, "Teach them everything about Veloxi FTL drives. How they work, how they fail, what the theoretical limits are. Everything." "Why?" Vathan asked. "Because your drive technology is faster than ours in short bursts, and our power systems are more efficient than yours over long distances. If we combine them, we get something better than either one alone." Vathan stared at her. In the galaxy he knew, Technology sharing between species was a transaction, carefully controlled, hedged with patents and restrictions and legal threats. Park was asking him to hand over the core secrets of Veloxy engineering to people he had known for less than a week. "What do we get in return?" he asked, and he hated himself for asking, because he already knew what the answer would be. "Everything," Park said simply. "Every piece of human tech we have. Engines, weapons, shields, materials, all of it. Open book, take what you need." And she meant it. Within hours, Vathan was standing in a room where human and Veloxy engineers were working side by side, sharing schematics, arguing over designs, building something that neither species could have imagined alone. Hybrid FTL drives that were faster and more stable than anything in the known galaxy. Weapon systems that combined human creativity with Veloxy precision. Shield configurations that drew on the strengths of both technologies. It was not just engineering. It was a new way of thinking that saw the universe differently, coming together and discovering that the differences were not weaknesses, but strengths. And then the messages started coming in. First, it was the Rithani, a small species of aquatic traders who had been paying tribute to the Dralkith for 80 years. They sent a coded transmission to Earth, asking if the rumors were true, if the humans were really going to fight, and when Park confirmed it, they offered star charts of Dralkith supply routes. Then the Korvathi, an avian species whose homeworld had been occupied for decades. They sent technical data on Dralkith's shield frequencies that they had been secretly collecting for years, waiting for the day when someone, anyone, would be willing to use it. Then the Mulgari, the Tevin, the Shasik, species that Vathan had never heard of, all of them oppressed, all of them afraid, all of them reaching out to this one small world, because for the first time in their lives, someone had stood up and said, "No more." Risava read the messages and sat in silence for a long time. And when she looked up, there were tears tracking down her gray carapace. "They have been waiting," she said quietly. "All of them. They have been waiting for someone to fight back." Park presented her battle plan on the eve of the Dralkith fleet's arrival. The holographic display showed 300 red icons bearing down on Sol like a wave of blood. And against them, 90 human ships, the defense grid, and a handful of allied vessels that had arrived in secret over the past few days. Risava looked at the odds and called the plan insane. Park corrected her. The word is creative. That night, Vathan stood at the observation window and watched Earth turn slowly below, blue and green and white, covered in clouds and oceans, and cities that glittered like scattered jewels in the dark. And he thought about how strange it was that this small, beautiful world full of loud, generous, terrifying people had become the place where the galaxy's future would be decided. The Dralkith fleet entered sensor range at dawn, 300 warships filling the screen like a wall of iron and fire. And on every frequency, in every language known to galactic civilization, Earth broadcast a single message. The words were old, Vasquez told him later, ancient, from a battle fought thousands of years ago on the surface of that blue world, when a small group of humans had faced an army that outnumbered them beyond all reason and had been told to surrender their weapons. They had refused, and their answer had echoed through human history ever since. The message that Earth sent to the Dralkith Armada, the message that every species in the galaxy heard, the message that Vathan would carry in his heart for the rest of his life, was this: come and take them. The Battle of Sol began with silence. 300 Dralkith warships hung at the edge of the system in a formation that stretched across the void like a dark curtain. And for one long held-breath moment, nothing moved. The stars watched, the planets turned on their ancient paths, and two civilizations stared at each other across the black. Then the Dralkith fleet commander, Grand Warlord Fesic, gave the order to advance, and the curtain began to fall. On the human side, 90 warships formed up in a defensive arc, between Earth and the approaching armada. They were outnumbered more than 3-1, smaller than most Dralekith vessels, and by every calculation known to galactic military science, they should have had no chance at all. But the humans had never been very good at math they did not like. And they were not alone. 12 ships joined the human formation that morning. Veloxi ships, hastily armed and upgraded with human technology, crewed by people who had spent their entire lives running and had decided, here, now, today, that they were done. The shimmering drift was among them. Vathan stood in the engine room of a ship he barely recognized. The gentle cargo hauler he had nursed through a dozen trade runs was now bristling with human weapons, wrapped in human armor, powered by the hybrid drives that Veloxi and human engineers had built together. She was not beautiful anymore, but she was strong, stronger than she had ever been, and when her engines hummed, Vathan could feel the vibration in all 4 of his hands, like a heartbeat. On the bridge, Tosk sat at the sensor console with his headphones in, metal music pouring into his ears at a volume that would have damaged human hearing. His 4 hands moving across the controls with the caffeine-enhanced precision that had become normal for the Veloxi crew. Beside him, the communications officer was sipping bug juice and cracking. Her knuckles, Captain Risava settled into the command chair and gripped the armrests the way she always did, hard enough to leave marks. But this time her face was different. There was no fear in it, no exhaustion, no quiet resignation. There was something new, something borrowed from the humans who had welcomed them when the rest of the galaxy had turned away. She opened the ship-wide channel and said the most un-Veloxi words ever spoken in the history of her species. All hands, battle stations. The Dralekith hit the human line like a fist hitting a wall, and the wall did not break. Human corvettes swarmed the leading edge of the armada, darting between the massive cruisers like insects around giants. And every one of them fought differently, every pilot choosing their own angle, their own moment, their own beautiful chaotic way of turning destruction into art. The Dralekith fired in disciplined volleys the way they always had, predictable, devastating against any species that fought by the rules. But the humans did not fight by any rules that existed, and the volleys that should have torn through a conventional fleet instead struck empty space where human ships had been a half-second before. Park commanded the battle from the station with the cold focus of a surgeon. She had studied the Dralekith for months, consumed every piece of intelligence that Risava and the other allied species had provided, and she had found what she was looking for. The fracture line, the hidden weakness that 200 years of Dralekith conquest had created, and that no one had ever lived long enough to exploit. The Dralekith were hierarchical to their core. Every ship followed the command ship. Every captain waited for orders from above. Every decision flowed down from the top like water through a pipe. Break the pipe and the water went everywhere. She kept that knowledge close and waited for the right moment. The battle raged across the inner system. Human ships took hits, some of them terrible. The destroyer Resolute lost half its hull and kept fighting, with atmosphere venting from a dozen breaches. The corvette Little Sister took a direct hit to the bridge, and the surviving crew rerouted controls to engineering and flew the ship from there. A frigate whose name Vathan never learned was cut in half by a Dralekith beam weapon, and both halves continued firing until their reactors went cold. When human ships were destroyed, their crews ejected in escape pods, and within minutes, rescue drones scooped them up and ferried them to reserve vessels, and half of those rescued pilots climbed into new cockpits and flew right back into the fight. The Dralekith could not understand it, this refusal to stay down, this insistence on getting back up every single time they were knocked down. Pops McRae was too old to fly, so he did something arguably more important. He sat in the dock station's Repair Coordination Center and managed damage control for the entire fleet. 17 ships simultaneously. barking orders to engineering teams scattered across the system, keeping vessels alive that should have been dead in the void 10 times over. When a Dralkith missile struck the station itself and blew a hole in the outer hull, 3 meters wide, Pop sealed the breach himself, one-handed, because his other hand was holding a communicator giving instructions to a repair crew on the frigate Hawkins. He welded the emergency plate into place, while the air screamed out around him, and did not stop talking the entire time. "No, you listen to me," he shouted over the roar of escaping atmosphere. "You reroute the coolant through the secondary manifold, and you bypass the main conduit entirely. I do not care what the manual says. The manual did not get shot at today. Do it my way, or that ship is dead in 5 minutes." Hawkins survived. The shimmering drift flew into the battle alongside the human fleet, and fought with a ferocity that surprised even Rasava. Galaxy ships had never been designed for combat, never been armed, never been crewed by people who intended to fight rather than flee. But something had changed in the days since they had landed on Earth. Something fundamental. Something that tasted like coffee, and sounded like metal music, and felt like the handshake of a species that refused to let strangers suffer alone. Tosk, who had been terrified of his own shadow a week ago, detected a Dralkith flanking maneuver 3 minutes before it reached the human line, and sent the data to Park, who adjusted the formation and turned the ambush into a trap. When Rasava praised him, he just nodded and turned up his music and kept working, his 4 hands flying across the console with a calm he had never known he possessed. Mounting on both sides, the Dralkith had lost over 60 ships, but they still had the numbers, still had the weight, still had the grinding inevitability of a force that could absorb punishment and keep coming. The human fleet was holding, but it was being pushed back, compressed, squeezed toward Earth. And then Park played her card. She had been watching Grand Warlord Thesic's flagship since the battle began, tracking its position, studying its guard formation, mapping the communication patterns that flowed from it to every other ship in the fleet. And she had identified the window, the one narrow gap in the formation that opened for exactly 90 seconds every time the Dralkith rotated their defensive screen. "Falcon Wing," she said into the command channel, her voice still perfectly calm. "You are go for sunbreak." 12 corvettes, the fastest ships in the human fleet, broke from the main formation and drove straight into the heart of the Dralkith. Armada, in a move that any sane tactician would have called suicide. They punched through the outer line, taking fire from every direction, lost 3 of their number in the first 30 seconds, and kept going. 9 ships screaming toward the flagship like arrows fired into the eye of a storm. The Dralkith guards closed in, and the corvettes split. 6 went high, 3 went low, and in the confusion, 1 ship made it through. A single corvette, piloted by a woman whose call sign was Ghost, and she put 2 antimatter torpedoes into the flagship's command bridge from a range so close that the explosion nearly took her with it. The flagship broke apart, and with it, the Dralkith command structure shattered. 300 ships that had fought as one became 300 ships fighting as none. Captains who had never made an independent decision in their careers suddenly had no orders to follow, no hierarchy to obey, no voice telling them what to do. Blindly, some turned to flee. Some fired on each other in the confusion. The human fleet surged forward, every ship, every platform, every drone, and the Veloxi surged with them, and the Rathani scout ships that had been lurking at the edge of the system joined in, and a Korvathi stealth vessel decloaked and added its weapons to the barrage. All the species that had been watching, waiting, hoping, threw themselves into the fight at the moment the tide turned. The Dralkith fleet broke, not gradually, not in stages, but all at once, like a dam failing, like a spell lifting. Ships scattered in every direction, running for the first time in the recorded history of the Dominion, and the Battle of Saul was over. In the silence that followed, Vathan stood in the engine room of the shimmering drift, and listened to the sound of his ship breathing, the hum of the hybrid drives, the whisper of the upgraded life support, the distant thump of music from Tosk's console. And he put all four of his hands flat on the bulkhead and felt the warmth of a ship that had come here to be patched up and was leaving as something entirely new. The galaxy changed after that day. Not all at once, not easily, but irreversibly. The Draelkith Dominion, humiliated and fractured, lost its grip on the species it had enslaved, and one by one, those species broke free and reached out to the small blue world that had stood for them when no one else would. The Sol Compact was formed within weeks, a mutual defense and trade alliance anchored by Earth, joined by the Veloxi, the Rithani, the Korvathi, and a dozen other species who had learned the same lesson on the same day. That the galaxy did not have to be a place where the strong devoured the weak, that kindness was not weakness, that the willingness to help a stranger was the most powerful force in the universe. Risada addressed the Galactic Council via hologram, and she told them a simple story. Told them about a ship that limped into a system looking for a patch job, and found instead a species that fixed things, not because they were paid to, but because it was right. A species that shared their technology, their food, their music, and their terrible, wonderful, addictive coffee with people they had no reason to trust. A species that looked at 300 warships and said, "Come and take them," and meant every word. Months later, the shimmering drift was permanently docked at Earth's orbital station as a cultural exchange vessel, which was a fancy way of saying that nobody wanted to leave. Vathan taught Veloxi engineering to human students who asked so many questions that his antennae ached by the end of every class. Popf was teaching him to play a card game called poker, which as far as Vathan could tell, was simply organized lying, and the humans were very good at it. Tosk had started a cross-species band with Marcus and two other humans, and a Rethani. Drummer, they played metal, obviously. They were terrible, but they were loud, and they were happy, and that was enough. On a quiet evening, Vathan sat by the observation window watching Earth turn below, and Vasquez came and sat beside him, and handed him a cup of coffee. He took it with two hands, and held it the way the humans had taught him, palms wrapped around the warm ceramic, and he felt the heat seep into his fingers. "You know," he said, "we only came here for simple repairs." Vasquez grinned, that wide, tooth-showing, impossible human grin, and she tapped her cup against his in the gesture the humans called a toast. "Yeah," she said, "that is how it always starts." Outside the window, the stars turned slowly in the dark, and somewhere out among them, a galaxy that had been afraid for a very long time was beginning to remember what hope felt like.